Lieutenant Colonel retired Art Brown. I was born and raised in Windsor, Ontario. Went to school there, and joined the Air Force right out of high school. And I always knew that the armed forces were going to be my thing. I had been in cadets, both Sea Cadets and Army Cadets when I was younger. And it was my lifestyle. It was what I enjoyed doing, and so I knew that I'd join up. So in April of 1975, I joined as a young private. I trained as what back then was called safety systems technician. And basically, we were responsible for systems on aircraft such as ejection seats and fighters, oxygen systems, all that safety gear like rafts and parachutes and survival gear. Those are the things that we took care of. So depending on what Air Force base you were on would determine what type of things you worked on. So if you were on a fighter base, obviously you worked on a lot of stuff related to those fighter aircraft. But if you were on a base, say with transport aircraft, then you dealt more with survival gear and that kind of stuff, because it didn't have parachutes. It obviously didn't have ejection seats and those kind of things. So it varied. But right out of my trade school, I had volunteered to go to an organization called the Parachute Maintenance Depot in Edmonton, Alberta. And I had to volunteer because you had to be an active parachutist, because they were packing parachutes for the Canadian Airborne Regiment that was stationed in Edmonton at the time. And in order to be a packer rigger, which was the term, you had to be a jumper. So you had to take the jump course, and they can't force you to do that, so you had to volunteer to go. And so I did. And they told me, after 2 years, I'd end up back off at an Air Force base somewhere. And 5 years later, I found myself still there. Because you gain skills and knowledge, and then they weren't getting enough guys to volunteer, so you end up staying longer. So that's how I started out. I eventually got back to an Air Force base and actually got posted just down the road in Portage La Prairie, back working with aircraft safety system stuff. And while I was there, I read in routine orders, which is basically papers that come out every month, basically, telling you what's going on around the base and also other things. And in there, they were notifying us that they were looking for people to reclassify, or what we call remuster, or change career fields, and remuster into a trade called Airborne Electronic Systems Operator. And that was basically end up flying on anti-submarine patrol aircraft on the CP-140 Aurora, which was just coming online in 1982, 1983. And so I applied, got accepted, and 2 weeks later found myself in Summerside, PEI, a base that's no longer there, doing my initial training for ASOP, they called it. And did some training on tracker aircraft, which we no longer have, and then eventually ended up in Greenwood, Nova Scotia, finishing my maritime operations training, and then got posted to 405 Squadron in Greenwood, and so now I'm into my second career. And while I was there, I had applied several times in each successive years to get my commission, and eventually was successful. So after only about 2.5 years in Greenwood in the flying job, I had to change career fields again, because there was no equivalent moving from an NCO position to an officer position. So I ended up training as an air weapons controller at the time, now called aerospace controller. And did the training in North Bay, Ontario, in the underground complex, about 800 feet underground. And when I graduated that course, I ended up being posted there, controlling aircraft involved with the NORAD, North American Aerospace Defense Command. And then from there, many other postings and deployments around the world. But that's in a nutshell 3 different careers, all within the Air Force.
Now,
and so I ended up going to the DRC as a military observer. I was stationed in the UN headquarters in the capital of Kinshasa. It's way down in the very lowest southwest corner of the country, and I ended up traveling extensively throughout the country, visiting some of our observer teams, and I'm not talking Canadian observer teams, but just observer teams associated with the mission. So they could be made up of many different countries, and I would visit those teams and see how they were operating, and then take that information back to the headquarters with me. So it was quite interesting, very eye-opening, especially being my first one and being in the Congo. In the center of Africa, and it's a huge country. It's the second largest in Africa. So it was an incredible experience, and one that I'll never forget. For both of those, the first one was for 10 months in 2009, 2010. We were involved in combat operations by that time for many years, but we were down in Kandahar, the base at Kandahar, just outside of Kandahar city, in the province of Kandahar. So that was down in the southwest part of the country, primarily desert, very, very hot in the summertime, and cooler, especially overnight, at night. And my primary role there was the operations officer for the Canadian Air Wing that was utilizing the airport there in Kandahar, and we had Hercules aircraft flying back and forth between a third country and into Kandahar. We also had one supporting troop and cargo movement within the country. And we also had Chinook helicopters and Griffin helicopters as well. So it was very, very busy and long days, but very fruitful work. Something, again, one of those deployments I won't forget. And then about 2.5 years later, I volunteered again to go back to Afghanistan, but this time it was going to be in the capital of Kabul, which is basically in the mountain region of the country. And now this time it was not a combat role, but as an advisor to an Afghan training facility there, and I would be an advisor to the company commanders there at this air university. It's incredibly important. I think educated people just understand so much more about the world around them, and how it affects them, and to be able to provide that support to Afghan children was just something that I think we will see. It will bear fruit later on. Especially if that education can be carried on, down the road, because as you know, Canada primarily pulled out in 2014 from operations in Afghanistan, and so I would hope that education is, being carried on, because all of that education, it provides jobs down the road. Because you just have that knowledge to do those kind of things, and having a job and being able to provide, make money and provide, put food on your table and a roof over your head for you and your family. All of that, I believe, comes easier with an educated population. One example is when I was in the Congo. You could pick out the school kids because they all wear uniforms, blue pants or skirts and a white top. But they were lucky because they were going to school because their parents were making enough money that they could afford to send them to school, because there was no such thing as publicly funded education. So unless you had parents with enough money to buy you a uniform, buy your textbooks, and enough to pay the teachers and keep the school running, you didn't go to school. And so as a consequence, you saw many, many kids out in the street begging for food, begging for money to try and make a daily living. Very interesting question. I mean, to me, holding that torch and carrying it high, for me personally, means continuing to do things like this interview, continuing to go out to schools and tell my personal story, but also to talk about our veterans of World War I, whom they're all gone now, and veterans of World War II in Korea, or any of our conflicts, or our peacekeeping time. We need to carry that on, and to me, that's what's carrying the torch, is making sure we continue to remember, that we hold Remembrance Day, and that we remember all our veterans, living and gone. Because growing up as a kid, I always thought that a veteran was those guys from the First World War, Second World War in Korea. And even long after I joined the armed forces, I didn't consider myself a veteran. But over time, the government has changed our thought process on that, and recognizing that anyone that has served in uniform, even RCMP, who serve our country, are veterans, and we should recognize that, both the living and the dead. Just recognize their sacrifice, remember what they did, and stop and take a moment. I always do whenever I can. I'm an avid cyclist. I ride around the city all the time, and I do bicycle trips, extended bicycle trips, several weeks, several months, and almost without fail, every time I go into a community, if I come across a cenotaph of any kind of memorial, I will stop and take a moment to read what it says and reflect on the sacrifices that memorial represents. So to me, that's what everyone should do. I hope that we are a world leader, as a democracy, a country to look at saying, wow, they got it right. They're doing everything right. And certainly hope that we don't have any more major conflicts around the world that Canadians are involved in. And I'm an optimist, but I also know that, in reality, we will never have a perfect world, and we will always need to have a robust and effective armed forces, and be willing to send them into harm's way. And I see that continuing even 100 years from now. I don't think the world is going to change that much where we're going to have a utopian place, and you can live without a military in our DNA. I get fairly upset when I speak to someone and the subject of democracy and elections, whether it's municipal, provincial, or federal, comes up, and someone tells me that they didn't vote for whatever reason, usually here because, oh well, it wouldn't matter or whatever. That really upsets me. I'm a firm believer that everyone who has the right to vote, and we certainly have that in this country because of our veterans and the places that we fought to preserve our democracy and way of life here in Canada, you should and everyone should go out and vote. So it really upsets me when I hear that people haven't voted. It's incredibly important, because otherwise you live in a dictatorship. You have one individual or a group of individuals basically telling you what to do and how to do it, and you don't have any say in it because you didn't have the capability to vote in local people that know your issues and can bring those issues up and try and have those issues solved by a larger group of people to help them do that.